1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Check, check. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, do I have a treat for you tonight? In this journey we call life and sports, sometimes we come across what has come to be known as a hater. And, you know, I'm not talking about your friend down the street who likes a different team than you kind of hater. I'm talking about living rent-free in someone's head for their entire existence kind of hater. I'm talking about someone who devotes their entire free time in life to simply hating. I mean, they would be first ballot into the Hater Hall of Fame. Ladies and gentlemen, this hater that we're gonna expose here today is called the Universe Galaxy. What this man does, what this person has a shtick of doing is essentially they're an MJ hater. Now, I'm no fan of MJ myself, really. You know, I'm more of a Michael Finley fan than I am a Michael Jordan fan. But this man is just such a disrespect to the game of basketball. He has tarnished what is known as basketball knowledge to such a point that I cannot stand for it any longer. And he's making me do what I thought I would never do, and that's defend someone other than my own favorite players of all time. So in this video, I'm going to be making the argument why Michael Jordan is the actual, objective, literal GOAT. No questions asked. I'll be breaking this up into parts. It might be a bit of a long video, to be honest. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over his line of argumentation, because we have to set the groundwork for the debate, right? We have to decide on the framework of which a debate can be held, or else it's a snipe hunt and we'll go round and round. So that's what I'll be doing first. I'll then be going through many of the argumentations I hear this person make in videos he's made, and it will be a rebuttal to these points. Now, also why I'm doing this is because this man does not argue fairly. He mutes people, puts them backstage, talks over them, mocks them, insults them, the whole 9 yards. Typical weak tactics that you would expect from a lesser opponent who knows they're outmatched. Nothing new over here. I've come to expect it at this point. So this is a win-win. I get to make my video and everyone gets some content. So here we go.
Round 1. Fight!
It's Christian on the beer.
So this section will be the only sort of non-basketball, non-statistical driven section that I have. And it's a direct reply to how the Universe Galaxy, or Tug, as we're going to call him. The reason why it's so frustrating to go onto Tug's channel is because Tug doesn't really engage in any objective reasoning. What I mean by this is he likes to make the definitive claim that Jordan is not the #1 player of all time, which is fine. You can make that claim, but it is a definitive claim, meaning you have to somewhat argue in lieu of Jordan, there must be someone else who is the GOAT if you can make the claim that he is not, correct? Or if they are not able to refute that or bring up someone who is better, or explain to me why this lot of statistical relevance in terms of the GOAT debate, why someone would have a greater claim to it. And that is only to summarize that we must make the claim that someone is the GOAT. We have to make an argument as to why someone is the GOAT. And what this person fails to do is respond to those claims, that definitive claim that he's made that we are providing a rebuttal to, he then sometimes goes and says, well, we can't really tell who the GOAT is, or there's several people who are the GOAT, or we can't compare the eras, etc., which is, in a vacuum, is true and fine, but that's not what's being done here. That's a snipe hunt. We're trying to make the claim that Jordan is the GOAT versus not the GOAT. And if you cannot provide me someone better in a rebuttal to us saying Jordan is the GOAT, then we have won the debate. So remember, at the end of the day, we have to make a claim that one is the GOAT, right? Brings me to the next layer of argumentation. A lot of times what Tug does is he claims that anyone who argues a pro-Jordan stance is a quote-unquote Jordan fanboy. Essentially, you're brainwashed, etc., to the point that you're not really arguing straight, and that's why you can't understand his argument. I'm not a Jordan fanboy, nor is calling anyone a Jordan fanboy even a good argument in itself. I never owned any Jordan gear, jerseys. I never was really into the Bulls or anything like that. As stated previously, I'm more of a Michael Finley fan than I am a Michael Jordan fan. Just because I can argue objectively for Jordan does not make me a Jordan fanboy. I never had any posters of him in my wall. I never owned any Jordans. I never stuck my tongue out when I played, etc. The next point in this section is that if you go and look at Tug's channels, he has 2 of them. If you go look at this man's channels, he has essentially devoted them to posting anecdotal stories and quotes from other greats and Hall of Famers who may say that Jordan is not the greatest, or that there was someone harder to guard, or that they considered someone tougher, etc., which is all fine again. The thing is that when you debate this man, if you bring up how one player's, like for instance, if you bring up how Larry Bird said that Jordan was essentially the greatest player ever, in a way, right? If you were just to bring that up as an example, he would give you a reason why that doesn't count or doesn't really matter. But yet all his channel is, right, is anecdotal stories of players saying they thought they were better, or that they beat Jordan one-on-one one time, or something like that, correct? So again, it just goes to expose the kind of bias that we're dealing with. If we wanted to make clips and stories of people saying Jordan is possibly the greatest or is the greatest of all time, ladies and gentlemen, I'd be here for weeks putting together that montage. Some other things that I have heard on his channel, and again, this video is mainly a rebuttal to things I've heard on his channel and things that he says oftentimes in arguments. Another thing I've heard said on his channel is someone has many times made the claim that there are 1,000 players better than Michael Jordan. Of course, he doesn't push back on this or really argue with that person. Of course, if you were to say Jordan is just top 20 maybe, or top 10, he would of course argue till the cows came home, and he would blow a gasket trying to say how dumb you are for saying that Jordan is top 10. Again, it just goes to expose the kind of person that we're dealing with here. So again, just to recap, being pro-Jordan does not make me a fanboy. That's a deflection. Your line of argumentation is a definitive claim that Jordan is not the GOAT, meaning that someone else must be the GOAT in his place, which he never really provides an answer for. And usually if you try to pin him down on it, it'll come to the conclusion that, well, we can't really decide, or there really isn't one true GOAT. That's not the statement being made. That's not the argumentation being put before the people that you challenge to come onto your show. And again, all the videos he puts on his 2 channels are totally irrelevant and are almost a moot point. Because if we were going to accept hearsay and anecdotal stories, my stack of papers would be a lot higher than yours if we were going to bring them to a metaphorical court of law, right? I could pile up days worth of people saying how Jordan is the greatest compared to how many times you could find people saying something else. So that's mainly it for getting the non-basketball part out of the way. Again, we have to have a framework in which we're going about deciding who the GOAT is. And remember, it is the GOAT, the greatest of all time. Not for a season. I've heard people on his channel argue that Nate Archibald was better because he had one 2020 season, 20 points, 20 assists. And Jordan never did that, so therefore Nate Archibald could be argued that he is better. We're talking about the greatest of all time, not the greatest of one season, not the greatest of one game, not the greatest of 5 seasons. We're talking about the greatest of all time. That's why it's the GOAT argument, okay? All time, all eras. You cannot hide behind eras. You cannot say we can't decide. There are few or many who could be GOATs. I know that people say GOATs in conversations all the time, right? To imply how great someone is. But if we're making the literal argument that someone isn't a GOAT, then you must refute it. You have to come out and make points. Now, as we begin to head into the statistical relevance and more of the hard stats of what makes MJ the GOAT, I want to keep in mind what I ended the last segment with, which is definitive claims require definitive responses and rebuttals. What I mean by this is I've previously mentioned how if you're ever good enough or are given enough time to kind of pin Tug down on some of the argumentation that he throws out there, a lot of the times you get the reply that, oh, well, you know, there's just so much that you could say for this or that, and there's so many great players, there's so many great eras, we could never truly decide who is the greatest of all time. If that's truly what you think, that's fine, but you then cannot make the definitive claim that Jordan is not the GOAT. These two ideas or lines of thinking cannot both be held at the same time. You cannot make a definitive claim and then have your reply or the answer as to why you have that claim be, well, I don't know, or we don't know, or we can't decide. They both cannot exist simultaneously. Now, the next layer of this that Tug does is the part of this video that's kind of titled statistical relevance or average or statistical weight. And this also ties in with needing a definitive boundary or framework in which we can decide who is the GOAT of all time, since that is the definitive claim that you're making. And the thing is that Tug doesn't really have any definitive rules about what makes someone the GOAT or someone not the GOAT. Another example of how he does this is if you were to bring up how great Michael Jordan was at a particular thing or category or basketball statistic, they might bring up how someone else was even better in that category, which again, in a vacuum, is fine. But if you were to say, well, Michael Jordan was second in this or third in this, and then he was fourth over here, and then he was first over here, and then he was sixth over here, when you sort of tally everything up, and if we were to sort of give each statistic or relative achievement some kind of statistical weight, then Jordan is easily a top 5 player of all time. Just going off basic knowledge of basketball and statistics alone. But Tug will never really engage with this line of thinking, because if we were to begin to qualify or quantify things and how much weight or influence they have or how important they are, then we would be able to nail down a few points and begin to build the argument about why MJ is the GOAT. And so this is what I mean when there is no definitive framework from the opposition, because they almost want to keep the waters murky in a way to where you can't ever gain any momentum or begin to build a structure in which you can then jump an argument off of. So because of this, we almost have to go back to formula in a way.
Back to formula.
And believe it or not, we have to start with championships. This is how elementary Tug's debating style is. It has actually been said and claimed on this show that basketball is a team sport and that championships don't really matter so much. Something to that nature. Of course, he would probably put it a different way just to argue. But essentially, they don't really give a whole lot of weight to championships in basketball. Well, to me, this is absolutely crazy. There is no other team sport where a championship matters more to an individual's legacy than perhaps basketball. The only other thing I can think of is maybe playing the position of quarterback. But in terms of team sports, I cannot think of another sport where a championship matters, perhaps more than anything, to a player's legacy to have won a championship or not, or multiple championships. But why is this, right? I'm not just going to make the claim that it is the most important, but why is this? Why do championships matter so much in basketball, which even the most fair weather fan could probably tell you that besides a quarterback in the NFL, championships probably matter the most to the NBA. It really has nothing more to do with anything other than just the dynamics of the game. In basketball, you are one of 5 players on your team on the court at any given time. You are 1/10 of the entire competition or the sport that is being played on what is a relatively small field, all things considered. Obviously smaller than football and soccer, I believe smaller than hockey. So there is really no team sport, especially one where there's at least 10 or more people, something like that. There really is no other team sport where a superstar or an elite player or a great player has such an influence on the game and has such control over the outcome, considering that they are 1/5 of their team's players on the court at any given time. And considering most of your elite players play at least 40 minutes a night, if not more, probably more unless they're resting or it's a blowout. And for these same reasons, this is why it's so important to a quarterback. A quarterback has such an influence on the game. They are a decision maker, a play caller, audibles. They are reading the defense, talking to the booth, the coach. They are eyes on the field. And that's even before they say hike and throw a ball in a 1-foot window with the defender on his teammate. And this is why it matters even less in something like baseball. A pitcher who probably has the most influence on a baseball game, minus maybe perhaps a really dominant hitter who plays every night. Pitchers only play every 4th game, and they usually don't even play for an entire game. And so that is why in large part, baseball players are not really looked down upon if they don't win a World Series. It's not really as big of a deal in baseball. If a pitcher goes out and he's getting 20 wins a season and is throwing a really good ERA, the league is going to look at him as one of the best pitchers of baseball, even if his team doesn't make it to the playoffs. You know, if a great pitcher never wins a World Series, it's not really held against him because there are so many other elements involved in baseball, and you only pitch every 4th day. I mean, even a great hitter is only one of 11 people in the lineup. It's completely different for specifically a quarterback and basketball. In basketball, as an elite athlete and as being one of the greatest in your sport, you have an extreme amount of direct influence in terms of how the game is played and the outcome of the game. Also keeping in mind, you play both offense and defense. I mean, a lot of times, if you look at a player like Jordan, he's guarding the first or second best player every night and is having the offense essentially run through him. And so the fact that I've heard them say that championships don't really matter or don't hold that much statistical weight is quite mind-boggling for a sport like basketball. So, with that being said, we kind of have to go back to formula and we have to look at championships all over again. And essentially where this argument always leads with Tug is that, well, Bill Russell had 11, correct? So therefore, Bill Russell is greater than Michael Jordan. And so you see the contradiction here where the championships matter if it means they get to dunk on Michael Jordan, but the championships don't matter if you're going to use Jordan's 6 rings to dunk on literally every other player that's ever played in the NBA. Again, this is a little bit of dishonesty and misdirection from Tug here, but championships absolutely do matter. And in regards to Bill Russell, we will now look at a bit of the era comparisons. Now, I am not an era hater. I am not a JJ Redick apologizer or anything like that. I don't 100% believe that it's as someone like JJ Redick would paint, and that when Bill Russell played, they were all plumbers and firemen. I don't believe that 100%. I think that if you were an all-time great, or if you were, really, really good in your time, you'd probably be really, really good or another great in any other era. I think that for the most part, not only is that true, but I think that's also probably the best way to argue the GOAT argument in terms of trying to be the most subjective, Now, with that being said, it's not 100% true. There's obviously differences in the eras. And when I compare the eras, I actually do not compare the gameplay or the athleticism per se. If you look back across the NBA over like 50, 60, 70 years, you know, the average height in terms of the league has only changed maybe 2 or 3 inches. You know, I just think objectively speaking, arguing the athleticism or the pace or the game style, I don't think is really how you should argue the eras. If you were great back in your day, you would at least be really good today. I mean, that's kind of where I start from, which again just makes sort of an overall good framework for us to argue from. And so we don't really argue a lot of subjective opinions or nuance. With that being said, there are some things to say about Bill Russell's era. And what a lot of people don't understand is that when Bill Russell played, there were only 8 or 9 teams in the league for the most part. It wasn't until his last 2 years in the league that they got up to 12 and then 14 teams respectively. The year before those last 2 years, there was only 10 teams. And for about 75 to 90% of Bill Russell's time in the league, there was only 8 or 9 teams in the entire NBA. On top of that, the playoffs consisted of 2 rounds, and that's it. You win 2 rounds, you win a title. Another thing that people don't know is that Bill Russell played with 7 other Hall of Famers during his time in the NBA. He played with Bob Cousy and or John Havlicek every year he was in the NBA. And it is fair to look at the business side and financial side of the NBA from the late 50s to the late 60s in terms of what is different today. The only argument that I make in terms of one of the major things that's different between the eras is, of course, the business that is now the NBA. Objectively speaking, the things I just pointed out in terms of the amount of teams and the amount of playoff games that you have to win, those are just objective realities that it's really hard to argue against. It is objectively harder to compete in a team of 30 growing competitive NBA teams where you have to win 4 rounds in the playoffs versus going through 8 or 9 teams in 2 rounds. It's just objectively different. Now, the business side of the NBA has definitely grown. What exactly does this mean in terms of an argumentation between the eras? Now, like I said, I'm not a JJ Redick apologist, and I did say that it's not 100% true. If we look strictly at the business side of it, it is somewhat true in terms of this. If you look at like the average household income compared to what NBA players were making until about the late 60s, mid 60s, it is quite possible that a lot of players would have found opportunities, perhaps doing other things that maybe paid a little bit less or the same or maybe more, and were a lot more secure and were a known business sector or commodity that they knew would be around forever, compared to the NBA, who had a lot of floundering teams that went in and out of bankruptcy. Teams moved a lot. It wasn't exactly a guarantee that the NBA was going to make it in the 50s and 60s. About the early to mid 60s, late 60s, I think it became pretty clear that the NBA wasn't going anywhere, barring some catastrophe or something like that. Again, what does this mean? Well, if there was some kind of odds or percentage that a player might be drawn to go do something else outside of the NBA that, let's just say, paid a little bit less or the same, or who knows, maybe a lot more, then you could arguably say that there were at least some players, or odds are that there was a lot of talent that was missed back in the days when the NBA was not the business that it was today. Meaning that compared to today, if you are good enough to play, the NBA will find you and they will make you an offer that you can't refuse. And they are leaving no stones unturned, especially when it comes to the international reach that they have now. And that is largely due to the resources. The business side of the NBA, it's growing. They are able to do things that they probably never even dreamed of doing back in Bill Russell's day. Ultimately meaning that the odds of them not finding and getting the best talent in today's league is slim to none. Whereas in the 50s and 60s, definitely was a higher probability that a guy or two maybe turned down an NBA contract or opportunity to go do something else. And again, how much of an outcome does that have in terms of today or Jordan's time versus Bill Russell's? I don't know. Maybe not very much, maybe a little bit, but it definitely was a part of it. I don't really use that in my argumentation on an average or daily basis, but it definitely is something to consider, along with the depth of field that they had to go through in the 60s. In fact, Bob Cousy is on record stating, even in his time or his day when he played, which was alongside Bill Russell, that he almost started a driving instructor school instead of joining the NBA. So it definitely was a real thing, right? I mean, we're talking about Bob Cousy, who is definitely one of the greatest to ever play, and he said he almost didn't go play in the NBA. What I'm saying is, with more money in the NBA comes a better recruitment of talent. Another era argument is the salary cap rules, and this will sort of move us along from what we'll call Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain's era more into the Bird and Magic era. Until about the mid 80s, you had a really kind of loose salary cap structure in which essentially the Celtics and Lakers had become the New York Yankees and Boston Red Sox of the NBA. They often signed away the best talent from other teams around the NBA. They could offer money and contracts that other teams could not keep up with. And this is why you largely had these two juggernauts on either side of the NBA who essentially were a lock to at least make their conference finals every year. I mean, they essentially were a shoo-in to do that. And again, this is a two-edged sword. You could argue that, well, for Magic and Bird and the players on those teams, it made it much harder, that final leap, right, to win a championship. It was much harder to do so, correct? And you'll get no arguments from me. Best NBA TV that's probably ever existed. I couldn't imagine growing up and watching that back in the day. Bird and Magic obviously put the NBA into another stratosphere in terms of the business side of it. But you could say that yes, because these two teams were so great that if or when they beat each other, that it must have been 10 times harder than other championships. There is that argument side of it, but there's also the argument that, well, if you're so good that you're just blazing past the regular season and, you know, your entire season is just trying to make it to the conference finals to rematch the Lakers every year, you could say that the odds are a little bit stacked in your favor as well. And again, I'm not taking anything away from those teams or that show of the NBA and all the amazing things that it was. But when you had the sort of the salary cap structured in the way you did in the NBA, essentially you had the Lakers and Celtics acting as the Yankees and Red Sox of the NBA during that time, which is how it had been in the NBA, by the way, for a very long time. Now, in the mid 80s, I think most notably 1984, is when they started to put in much more strict salary cap rules and other incentives for smaller market teams. So a lot of things changed with the salary cap in the mid 80s that essentially would begin to equal out and sparse out the talent that was in the NBA to where it would make teams a little more even and more competitive with each other. So just to recap, we have to put some kind of definitive qualification or weight onto statistics and achievements, coupled with the fact that just because Jordan may not be the singular best player at a particular thing is not grounds for dismissing him as the GOAT, as there is a statistical weight or average that we should overall be looking at to argue with. This then leads us to roll over into championships as one of the main defining factors of what makes someone a GOAT or not. Championships are extremely important in basketball. And of course, when championships are brought up, the obvious rebuttal is Bill Russell. And they use the line of argumentation that since Bill Russell had more championships, he must be better than Jordan. And in terms of strictly championships, because obviously statistically, Jordan outperforms Russell in many ways, but just in terms of championships, and again, Bill Russell played at a time when the odds were skewed in the favor of only a few teams. He played with 7 other Hall of Famers when there were only 8 or 9 teams in the league, and they had to win 2 rounds of playoffs. Again, not trying to take anything away from Bill Russell, and I still think he would be a great player to this day, but in terms of him winning, I think it's a little overinflated. I think it came in a time when championships were at their absolute easiest to win. I think there's almost no arguing that. And compared to the only other big man or competition that he had at the time, Wilt Chamberlain, Wilt handled Bill pretty well statistically when they matched up head to head. And then of course we have Magic and Bird's era, in which these two teams were the Red Sox and Yankees of the NBA, essentially stacking up monster all-time lineups. And again, it goes two ways. You could say that that makes the final championship harder. The ultimate boundary that you have to get over is perhaps harder, but at the same time, the odds are also massively skewed in your favor to simply reach the finals, as it were anyways. And so as we go forward, it's important to remember how things are weighted, why we put importance on certain things, and or why they are important. And although I am not an era hater, as I would say, there definitely are differences in the eras. Again, I don't pay attention to how people play. I don't try to make subjective arguments when it comes to the eras, okay? I don't really demean another era over another. Saying that one is softer or tougher than the other, I don't think really is a good argument either. But there are some very objective things you can look at between eras that make sense and that can't really be denied. And so I'm not even really here to say one era is better than the other. I don't really think that way, if that makes sense. That's not really how I would go about arguing. I would simply just point out the obvious and objective differences in the eras that could help or hurt a certain player or bolster a certain championship over another, correct? Because we can all agree that one man's championship is not always equal to a separate man's championship. Now, before we dive into the team and opposition segment of this part of the video, let's remember why we usually do this, and it always happens in almost any debate about a particular team or player. The reason why we do this is to try and remove as many variables as possible, or to try and whittle down the one particular team or player that we are discussing. There always comes up the topic of who they played with and against. In any debate, this will always come up eventually and is necessary or is a part of any thorough discussion on any topic regarding sports or a particular athlete and comparing them to other players. It's only natural. But again, why do we do this? The reason why we do this is because we're trying to quantify or qualify or remove as many variables as possible that are around a particular player when trying to build a case for them or argue against them. Whether people inherently know why they do this or not, that's essentially the goal of the experiment. How many things can we pin down or give a value to that either helped or hurt a player during their time so that we can better compartmentalize that player and what they've truly achieved? Consider discussing who a player has played with or against, almost like a math equation. We do this to remove the team aspect and the other variables involved in the debate as best possible, which again would sort of go against the whole defense that Tug brings up in terms of why championships are not weighted as much to him as they may be to other people. Now, probably the best way to go about this, or where we should start, is looking at some of the help that other greats had when they won championships or had their success. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Bill Russell played with 7 other Hall of Famers during his championship run. And just so everyone is aware, for the record, playing with 7 other Hall of Famers definitely puts you at the high end of that watermark. Also keeping in mind that this was in a time when the NBA was smaller, meaning that the Boston Celtics were absolutely stacked to the gills compared to their opponents. Now, what can be said about Bill Russell is at least he made the most of his help and won 11 rings. We could also go to someone who was very statistically dominant, such as Wilt Chamberlain, and of course the fact that he only won 2 rings sort of puts him out of the elite GOAT status conversation to most people. I'm not going to make that argument right now, but most people probably keep him out of the GOAT argument because he did not win so much. But what people don't know about Wilt Chamberlain is that he actually played with 9 other Hall of Famers during his time in the league and could only amass 2 championships, which unfortunately for Wilt Chamberlain is a big asterisk on his career and his record. And if you are going to argue that basketball is such a team game like Tug does, then obviously it would be really hard to put Wilt as the GOAT if he cannot even accomplish the greatest achievement in team sports regarding basketball with 9 other Hall of Famers during his career. It's really hard to put Wilt as the GOAT of all time with only 2 rings, given how many Hall of Famers he also played with and the fact that he benefited from a lot of the same things that Bill Russell did in terms of a much smaller field of competition and there only being 2 to 3 rounds of playoffs early in his career. And so as we look across the horizon and we find the next basket of players who had multiple championships, we come across the obvious Los Angeles Lakers, who won 5 during their stretch in the 80s. And more specifically with the Lakers, I'll be looking at Kareem, who won an additional championship in 1970-1971 with the Milwaukee Bucks. Now, for Kareem's first championship, he played on a team with 2 other Hall of Famers in Oscar Robertson and Bob Dandridge, as well as there only being 17 teams in the NBA and only having to go through 3 rounds of playoffs. Now, as we move forward an entire decade, which I think is important to state that Kareem won a championship with 2 other Hall of Famers, but it would take him an entire decade to get back on top. And it wasn't until he joined up and got the help of another top 10, top 15, depending on where you put him, great in Magic Johnson. But what people don't understand is that the championships that the Lakers won in the 80s, as I've stated previously, were just monster all-time lineup. And during that run in the 80s with the Lakers, there were a total of 6 Hall of Famers from the early 80s to mid to late 80s on those Lakers teams. Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, James Worthy, Jamal Wilkes, and Bob McAdoo. And Michael Cooper might also get in the Hall of Fame, as I think it's only his second year to be tried, and many think that he will probably eventually get in. So you're looking at a total of 7 Hall of Famers on one team during one decade. Now, counting that Lakers team or era along with his championship he won with Milwaukee and Oscar Robertson and Bob Dandridge, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar played with a total of 8 other Hall of Famers, if we're going to count Michael Cooper, 7 if not. Again, tremendous help to get those 6 rings. Now, obviously, Magic Johnson won 1 less championship than Kareem, so that's why I started with Kareem. But the same can also be said for Magic, correct? He played with 5 other Hall of Famers if we count Michael Cooper. And one last caveat I want to hint on in terms of the Lakers during the 80s is the Finals MVP. Now, I don't really think the Finals MVP is that big of a deal. It's almost like a cherry on top. We all sort of know who the best player is on either team, and if that team happens to win, usually the NBA Finals MVP is a pretty easy pick. But just to further illustrate how absolutely stacked these Lakers teams were in the 80s, during their 5 championships, they had 3 different Finals MVP: James Worthy, Kareem, and Magic. Now, again, I'm not really saying it's a big deal if they did or didn't win the Finals MVP. That's not really my argument. The argument is just to show how dominating those Hall of Famers were on that team or that era of teams, that 3 different players won a Finals MVP. That is how good a lot of those players were. The fact that you have Magic and Kareem on the same team and still James Worthy wins an NBA Finals MVP, again, just illustrates how deep and how much talent were on those teams. Now, obviously, the other dominant team in the 80s was the Celtics. Surprisingly, the Celtics do not have as many Hall of Famers or other elite or all-time great players that the Lakers did. Now, obviously, the Celtics were stacked as well. They had many other all-stars and great players during their run in the 80s as well, but they did not have Hall of Famers and all-stars coming off the bench, if that makes sense. In fact, Larry Bird technically only only played with 2 other Hall of Famers in Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish. Technically, Dennis Johnson did get put into the Hall of Fame, and I think he is overall worthy to be there, but just for argument's sake and to be transparent, he was sort of put in after his death to commemorate his life more than I think he was put in for his play. But I think his play as well is good enough to be in. Maybe barely, but I think good enough. He won championships on 2 different teams, was a 2-time All-Star, was a 2-time All-NBA, and won a Finals MVP as well when he was on the Sonics. And of course was most known for his defense, probably more than anything else, being a 9-time All-Defensive Player. Larry Bird also technically won his first championship with Nate Archibald as well, who is also in the Hall of Fame. This would bring Larry Bird's Hall of Famers that he played with to a total of 4, if we're going to honestly count Dennis Johnson and acknowledge the fact that Larry only played with Tiny for 4 years, winning 1 championship. But for every year that Larry Bird played, he had at least 2, sometimes 3 All-Stars, as they tend to rotate Parrish, McHale, and Dennis Johnson there for a few years. And another point I'd like to illustrate with the Celtics to kind of compare and contrast the NBA Finals trophy argument was that Larry Bird was clearly the best player on the Celtics year in and year out, which couldn't always be said for the Lakers during their run. And although Larry Bird only won 2 out of the 3 Finals trophies in terms of the championships his teams won, many would say that Larry Bird was also easily the best player the first year he won his championship, but that they felt like giving it to a more veteran player in Maxwell. Larry Bird that year was clearly the Celtics' best player in the regular season and was clearly the best player during the playoffs and in the finals. Larry Bird scored 2 less points than Cedric Maxwell, but got 6 more rebounds, more than doubled his assist, and averaged over 2 steals per game. And many would say that during that finals was some of Larry Bird's best play, as he just seemed to be everywhere in terms of making plays in that finals against the Houston Rockets. Now, those are largely the greats that people bring up pre-Jordan's time. Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, and Larry Bird. Now, of course, there are tons of other great players during that time, right? But in order to keep this video as concise as possible, which it's already going to be long, those are usually the guys who are consistently brought up when being compared to Michael Jordan before Michael Jordan's time. Now, I also largely focused on these guys because, again, it goes back to the statistical weight. When you take in their statistical achievements over time, longevity again does play into it a little bit. You can't just be good for a couple years. These are the guys who dominated for the longest amount of time and were at the top the longest when they were in the NBA. They have also the greatest individual as well as team accomplishments in terms of being able to have, again, this thing called a statistical weight in which they can be argued amongst some of the better players to compare against Jordan. And in terms of team help, besides possibly Larry Bird, I think there is no doubt that those players have all had much more help and much better talent around them when they were winning. And so this brings us to a sort of nice transition from the pre-Jordan era, and we're going to go ahead and skip to the post-Jordan era, and I will come back and examine Jordan's championships. I wanted to, again, reiterate the points that I had made about the salary cap differences and the rule changes that were put in place in the mid-'80s to try and help spread out the competition. So I did some research and I found an interesting statistic. So what I did was from 1960 to 2010, I went through every All-Star game and I counted up the amount of Hall of Famers compared to non-Hall of Famers that would be in those games. And the reason I did this was to sort of illustrate how much the game has expanded in both size and in competition. Essentially what I set out to do was to prove how before the salary cap was implemented, you would essentially have what we will call the elite tier or elite crop of players who would essentially be selected to the All-Star game every year. And what I was hoping to find by doing this, or the point that I was hoping to prove, is how much more consolidated the talent used to be before the salary cap. and in contrast, hoping to prove how much more the talent would be spread out going forward once those salary cap changes had been made. And again, ultimately my point to this is that post those salary cap changes in the mid 80s, it would sort of lend credence to the fact that it is much harder for a singular player to remain atop the pile of other great players during their time. If in theory you are going to have more teams with less Hall of Fame or elite tier caliber players on them, it is then much harder, in my opinion, for a singular player to remain consistently on top. And what I found is that from 1960 to 1986, which would roughly be a year or two after the salary cap changes were implemented, the percentage of non-Hall of Fame players on all-star teams was 26%. Contrastly, from 1987 to 2010, I found the percentage of non-Hall of Fame players on all-star teams rose all the way up to 37%, which is quite an increase, all things considered. And so in my opinion, what this essentially proves post-salary cap era is that the talent was much more spread out. It was much harder for you as a singular player to stay on top, considering that all the other teams would in theory have a much better chance at being able to compete with one another. The days of having 4, 5, 6 plus Hall of Famers on one particular team for an extended amount of time would be over. Now, there would be a few outliers here and there in terms of it would be possible to maybe have 2 or 3 Hall of Famers on a team and you happen to maybe trade for one other great for a season or two, or perhaps you draft an immediate impact player who would go on to be in the Hall of Fame, such as when the Warriors got KD, or perhaps when the Spurs got Kawhi Leonard. But the days of being able to stack up a lineup and keep 4, 5, 6 plus Hall of Famers for 5 to 10 plus years would be over. And so that being said, let's go from the pre-Jordan era to the post-Jordan era. And again, I'm going to come back in another segment and further analyze Jordan's championships on their own. But before we do, I have to touch on Hakeem Olajuwon real quick in terms of him winning back-to-back championships when Jordan was largely retired. Now, it's sort of a shame they never got to play each other, as the Houston Rockets championships are sometimes disregarded by the NBA community due to Jordan being retired, but they should be acknowledged nonetheless. Now, I think Hakeem is criminally underrated. He's probably a top 3 to 5 center of all time. And of course, only winning 2 championships sort of keeps him out of the elite GOAT debate. But the 2 championships that Hakeem won, he did with perhaps some of the least amount of help that's ever been given to an elite player such as Olajuwon. Now, the second year, I know they got Drexler, so that sort of changes things. But Hakeem's first championship really should be commended for how little help, statistically speaking, he had on that team when they did win. It's just unfortunate for the Rockets that they could never play the Bulls before or after their back-to-back rings to sort of validate and prove themselves. But all you can do is play the people in front of you. So I did want to give a quick shout out to Olajuwon. Olajuwon finished top 10 in 4 categories when he retired, which is almost unthinkable in a way. But I did want to touch on the Rockets and Hakeem before we went to the post-Jordan era. Now, as we move out of the late 90s and Jordan has retired by now, the first dynasty or handful of players that come up are going to be the Lakers and Spurs dynasties that started in the year 2000. And to further illustrate my point, you have the Lakers winning a three-peat with only 2 Hall of Famers, which again is very impressive. And as far as I could tell from my research, there's only been one other time that 2 Hall of Famers have taken their team to a three-peat, and that of course would be Scottie and Michael during their first run beginning in 1991, which again we'll come back to later. But again, this goes to make further evident the fact that the days of having a stacked lineup of Hall of Famers were now a thing of the past. And I think most people would objectively argue that the two-headed monster of Shaq and Kobe would probably outweigh and out-average Michael and Scottie, simply because Kobe and Shaq are so much better than Scottie in terms of their statistical achievements on the floor. Again, I'm not taking anything away from Scottie, but I think most people would agree that Kobe and Shaq in terms of players on their own are both, I don't want to say head and shoulders better than Scottie, but I think most people would take Shaq or Kobe over Pippen in a draft 9 times out of 10. And of course, from that three-peat of the Lakers starting in the year 2000, we obviously now go to the San Antonio Spurs and Tim Duncan. This is one of the anomalies post-salary cap era of a franchise having an absolute stacked team. He got to play with a total of 4 other Hall of Famers while he won his 5 championships. He had Robinson in 1999 and then also had Kawhi on the other bookend in 2014. And again, to sort of go back to using the NBA Finals MVP, Tim Duncan only won 3 out of the 5 Finals MVP awards in terms of the championships he won. Again, I do this only to illustrate and to show how stacked those teams were and how much help he had during those championships. And so just to reiterate, I'm not saying that Jordan going 6 for 6 with Finals MVP is necessarily an amazing accolade that I'm putting a ton of weight on. I'm more or less using it to show that when Jordan played and when Jordan won, there was absolutely no doubt he was the best player on the floor every time. Shaquille O'Neal would then go on with the Miami Heat to win a championship in 2006. And obviously he was past his prime at this time. He obviously wasn't the best player on the team anymore. That would go to Dwayne Wade, who would also win that Finals MVP. But along with Dwayne Wade and Shaquille O'Neal, they also had Gary Payton and Alonzo Mourning. And again, I know they're way past their prime, so I'm not going to put a lot of weight on that. But again, it was a pretty deep team, all things considered, actually looking back. And they did beat my 2006 Mavericks in that final. And I thought the Mavericks had a better season that year. But obviously the experience kind of showed out in the end, unfortunately, as well as Dwayne Wade playing out of his mind. And so after Shaq wins his 4th, we then, of course, have Kobe going back-to-back again. And he would do so with the help of Paul Gasol, who many think will be a first ballot Hall of Famer. Now, after these 2 championships by Kobe, we essentially roll into the Dwayne Wade, but largely LeBron James era. And while Dwayne Wade should be mentioned, I don't know if he makes the sort of elite of the elite cut in terms of championships compared to not only someone like LeBron, but Kobe or Duncan or Shaq or even Curry, who I think, given the statistical relevance with championships, I would probably put all those players above Dwayne Wade. And it also makes it hard for Dwayne, considering that many considered LeBron James the best player on his team the 2 years they won championships together. And of course, as we know, LeBron and Dwayne Wade are both Hall of Famers themselves, who would team up with Chris Bosh, who is also a Hall of Famer. And then even further, they would add Ray Allen the next year when they won their 2nd championship, meaning that Dwayne Wade and LeBron played with 2 and 3 Hall of Famers respectively for those 2 years they won rings, which again, for the post-salary cap era, is still a little bit on the high end to have 3 Hall of Famers to play with. This would of course bring LeBron's total to 2 rings, and as we all know, he would go on to win 2 more. Now, with his championship in Cleveland, he did have Kyrie Irving and Kevin Love on his team. Now, I think both of those players are semi-borderline, but what I could find in terms of probability, it looks like Kevin Love might make the cut. Again, it's not a sure thing, but it appears like the probability is on his side. Now, obviously, he's not first ballot or anything. It may take him a couple times or a lot of times for him to get in, but I do think Kevin Love and Kyrie Irving will eventually make the cut to get into the Hall of Fame, especially considering Irving has probably at least a couple good years left in him to pad his stats. And while LeBron was clearly the Finals MVP of that team and the best player on the floor, Kyrie's defense on Curry for that series should not go unmentioned. And then obviously that would bring us to his championship with the Lakers a couple years ago. And on that Lakers team, he had 3 other Hall of Famers in Anthony Davis, Dwight Howard, and Rajon Rondo, who, again, I think Rajon Rondo is a bit of a close cut, and we'll see what happens, but winning that championship with the Lakers probably got him over the hump, I think. He's about a 65% from what I can see in terms of odds to get into the Hall of Fame. And then this will, of course, eventually lead us into the final player of the more modern era, and that would be Steph Curry. And of course, as we know, Curry has played with his two more than likely Hall of Famers in Draymond Green and Klay Thompson. And it should also be noted that Andre Iguodala and Kevin Durant won 1 and 2 Finals MVP awards respectively. So, if I were going to take all of these quote-unquote elite players, this basket of GOATs, if you will, here's essentially the tally that we get of how many championships they respectively won and the total number of Hall of Famers that they played with. And then there's Jordan. Now, a lot of people might immediately say that, well, Jordan technically played with 3 Hall of Famers in Rodman, Pippen, and Kukoc, which is something that Tug has brought up before when I bring up this statistic. But people need to realize that Kukoc largely got in for his international achievements and not because of his play in the NBA. But to think that Kukoc is simply an NBA Hall of Famer would be very misleading. And further, of all the Hall of Famers that I have listed previously with other players, none of them have gotten into the Hall of Fame due to any sort of international play. The only one that you might be able to say did was Paul Gasol with Kobe, but Paul Gasol would be a first ballot Hall of Famer minus his international play. I don't think the same can be said for Tony Kukoc. Now, the only other small caveat that I will address here is Kobe. Kobe technically won his 5 rings with only one other Hall of Famer on his team at the time, which again is very impressive. But since Shaq won all 3 of the finals MVPs when they had their three-peat and essentially was the leader of that team, as great as Kobe was, I thought that it was only necessary that I mention he played with 2 Hall of Famers in total. But if you wanted to put an asterisk next to his name, then that would be fair. But since I didn't do that for Jordan's three-peat from one to the next, I'm going to leave it as is. And so, as we can see here, from the total number of championships won by the more elite players in NBA history, compared to the amount of different Hall of Famers they won those championships with, it could be argued that MJ has won the most with the least amount of help. And even further, even if we did a weighted average in terms of how many Hall of Famers were on your team per championship, essentially you would have Kobe and Jordan at the top of the pile, probably followed up by Shaq in third. Given that these 3 players all won three-peats with only one other Hall of Famer on their team, which statistically speaking would bring their averages way down, compared to someone like Russell or Wilt, Kareem, Magic, and Bird, as well as LeBron, Wade, and Duncan, who every year they won had a minimum of 2, if not 3 or 4 Hall of Famers on their teams. But since we are trying to sort of encapsulate whole careers here, this is probably the most efficient way and quickest way to do it. And I would further argue that the three-peat that Kobe and Shaq had, they were easily better players than Scottie Pippen during that point in their career. And I believe most people would agree. I also wanted to touch on Scottie Pippen real quick. You know, a lot of times the argument is brought up that Scottie was this really great player that, you know, perhaps would have been even better had Jordan not been around. And or I've heard the argument before that Pippen was so good for the 2 years that Jordan was not in the league. And so I went back and I looked at Scottie's stats for the 2 years that Jordan retired versus Scottie's entire time with the Bulls, minus his rookie year, because his rookie year was a bit of a statistical outlier in terms of being down in the stats. And essentially we can see right here that Scottie actually suffered when Michael Jordan left. Now, he averaged 1 more point per game and got 1 more rebound per game, but his percentages across the board went down, which in my opinion clearly shows that Scottie Pippen was a much better and much more efficient player when Jordan was actually on the floor with him. And for all this talk of how good Scottie would have been without Jordan or how good he was by himself, he honestly wasn't that much of a different player. And so you could see that as a plus or minus against Jordan depending on how you look at that. But this essentially proves that Scottie was who he was with or without Jordan. And the fact that he's a career 20-7, 20-8 kind of player, I think again goes to show that in terms of a sidekick or a second best player to one of the all-time greats, Scotty honestly, statistically speaking, was not as good as what many other elite players had during their championship runs. With that being said, in the next segment, I'm going to be addressing some of the more direct critiques that Tug has about Jordan, which will encapsulate Scottie Pippen, the Bulls roster, as well as other miscellaneous things that Tug has leveraged against Michael Jordan. Things such as him not being a good team player, or even criticisms that he is a bad defensive player. And then for my last and final segment after that, we will dive into a lot more of the hard stats of Michael Jordan and things that he has achieved and where he may rank all time on some of the more important categories. I'm now going to directly address a couple of the things that Tug has said on his show, or other things that people have said that he doesn't push back on in terms of Jordan's quote-unquote weaknesses. Now, before going in to this segment, I want everyone to remember that Michael Jordan is a shooting guard. Why do I say that? Well, it's relative when we are sort of comparing stats or making critiques on people in terms of perhaps what their job or responsibility is. So, for example, if you were going to make the complaint that, well, Steph Curry just doesn't post up enough for me. I mean, yes, if you wanted to make that critique, I guess technically in a vacuum, that's a valid critique. But in a pragmatic real-world sense, that's not Steph Curry's game. That's not his strengths. That's not what they ask him to do. That's not exactly how he's gotten to where he is. Or another example would be, yeah, but Tim Duncan wasn't a great three-point shooter. Sort of nuanced kind of goalpost-moving arguments like this should not be taken seriously. But I'm going to address them anyways because he's still wrong. So, the first thing I want to address that Tug has once made the claim of is that Jordan is not a good leader. And I think what Tug means to say is that Jordan does not lead the way I like a team leader to lead a basketball team. And I think largely what this comes from is that Jordan is not like a rah-rah guy, or maybe he just thinks Jordan's assist numbers are not good enough, so it's hard to say he's a good team player. This kind of goes back to the Kobe Bryant discussion sometimes, in that there are some players who lead by example and are not necessarily uplifting and positive reinforcement kind of guys. They lead by example by being the first to show up and the last to leave. It kind of is silly to say Jordan is not a good team leader when he takes his team to the championship 6 times and wins. You can say you don't like his style all you want, but at the end of the day, Jordan is easily one of the best leaders the NBA has ever had, simply by the fact that he wins. The number one thing I want in my leader is to show up when it matters and to know that they'll be there when our team needs them. That is ultimately what a leader is. And Michael Jordan was all of that and then some. And of course, we all know Jordan is probably a bit of an asshole. To be honest, to be great at anything, you have to be a bit of an asshole. And so I don't really take this critique very seriously. This is a very opinionated, subjective critique that he lays against Michael Jordan. But the argument that Jordan is not a good team leader, I think holds almost no weight. Now, perhaps you could look at something like Scottie in terms of how he's sort of recently complained about how Jordan was, But again, even as a team leader, your job is not necessarily to be liked. Your job is to be a leader. Your job is to show up and to pull your team through tough times. And the fact that Jordan won 6 championships and his team knew every day when they went to go play that Jordan would be there and that Jordan took no days off, I think speaks more than volumes about the kind of leader that Jordan was. Even if you wanted to argue that he was just a maniacal and selfish player that didn't so much care for the team aspect, I'm still not even sure that matters. Even if a guy is a maniacal, selfish asshole, but he is driven to achieve success to such a point that he can put people on his back and lead them to 6 rings, I'm not really sure you could say he's a bad leader just because of his style of play or his attitude that he takes towards the game. So that is my reply to the Jordan not being a good team leader stance that Tug has often taken on his channel. And if I can just sort of speak from my own experience, obviously Dirk is my favorite player subjectively of all time. You know, Dirk was never really considered a good leader either until he won. Your job is to show up, and for anyone who's ever played with Dirk, they absolutely know the time that he put in to perfect his game. They knew that he wanted to win. There was never a question with Dirk if he wanted it enough. And I think if you're going to be the best player on your team, I think that's essentially the most minimal thing you can do is be the first one to show up, the last to leave, put in the work and make sure your teammates understand that you are doing your part to pull your weight when the time comes. And that easily rolls into them knowing that you want it. There's nothing worse than having a leader or a good player on a team or just a teammate in general who you question their motivation or desire to win. I don't think that was ever the case with Jordan. The next critique I hear, and you guys won't believe this one, is that Jordan was overrated as a defender, or perhaps just an average defender is sometimes a claim that Tug makes. And so I did my job and I did a little stat digging. And this is the part where I want people to remember that Jordan is a guard, right? So if Jordan does not get a lot of blocks, that's not something to hold against Jordan. If Jordan doesn't lead the league in assists, that's not necessarily a knock on Jordan. All players have different strengths and weaknesses, but even for the ones that Tug says is a weakness, I'm going to prove aren't true anyways. So let's start with steals. Since Jordan is a guard, steals would make sense in terms of a place to start. Jordan is tied for second all time in terms of the amount of years he led the league in steals. He was a 3-time steals champion. And surprisingly, Chris Paul is first with 6, which is kind of crazy that Chris Paul has doubled up second place in terms of that award. But keep in mind, Jordan has more steals and more steals per game than Chris Paul. Jordan is 3rd all-time in steals, and he is tied for 2nd all-time for steals per game. And so for these next few categories, in terms of rebounds and blocks, which remember, Jordan is a guard, right? In terms of rebounds and blocks, let's look at what Jordan has done. For guards, Jordan is 7th all-time in rebounds, and he is tied for 5th in rebounds per game. For guards, he is 2nd all-time in blocks and 1st all-time in blocks per game. Jordan was a 9-time first team all defensive player, which is 6th all-time in terms of total defensive teams. He is tied for 1st in terms of all-time first defensive teams. And in terms of just guards, he is 2nd all-time in terms of total defensive teams nominated for behind Kobe. He won the Defensive Player of the Year once, and from my research, I also believe that he was 2nd one year and 3rd another year. I also did some stat digging, and I tried to find out what the historical records were for Defensive Player of the Year shares in total for players throughout NBA history. When this award was first introduced, the Defensive Player of the Year, it was given to Sidney Moncrief for the first 2 years, and he was a guard. Then we had Mark Eaton at center, Alvin Robertson as a guard, who was, by the way, the #1 steals per game leader at a crazy pace. He's like almost 1 steal per game more than 2nd place, which just seems like a ridiculous stat, to be honest with you, for a career. After Alvin Robertson, we had Michael Cooper. Michael Cooper is also a guard. And then after Michael Cooper in 1987, we have Michael Jordan winning it in 1988. And what's sort of interesting about the Defensive Player of the Year award after Jordan won it is that it started to become heavily skewed to the big men, essentially nothing but centers and power forwards, won the award after Jordan did. The only time guards won it after Jordan was Gary Payton in 1996. And then we have to wait another 26 years until last year when Marcus Smart won the award. So keep that in mind when we talk about Defensive Player of the Year awards, that they are heavily skewed to the big men, which is fine. You know, if that's the way it is, then that's the way it is. So I went back and I found this website that this guy had essentially gone back, combed through the stats, and he looked up Defensive Player of the Year shares throughout history. And in terms of all-time Defensive Player of the Year shares, Jordan is 23rd total all-time, which may not be the greatest number for the elite of the elites, but keep in mind he is second all-time for guards in Defensive Player of the Year shares, behind Gary Payton. And if we strictly look at defensive win shares, which again is a statistic heavily dominated by the big men because it is more than likely heavily skewed towards rebounds, he is 4th all-time in guards, strictly for defensive win shares. And so if we tally all of this up in terms of strictly his responsibility as a guard on defense, I think the argument could be made that Jordan may be one of the best defensive guards that has ever played, at least top 5 defensive guards that have ever played. His blocks and steals alone for his position are very impressive. And even when I went to go look at his rebounds per game, I was still a little surprised. I didn't think they would actually be quite as high as they were. And so is Jordan the greatest defender of all time? Probably not. But in terms of his position and what he achieved while he played basketball, I think it's very safe to say that Jordan is probably one of the top 5, at the absolute worst, top 10 defensive guards that has ever played. And another interesting stat that I found, which I almost couldn't believe, but Jordan is the only player to twice record a season with 200 steals and 100 blocks. It's only been done 2 other times by 2 separate players, Scottie Pippen and Hakeem Olajuwon. Think about how good those guys are defensively, and Jordan did it twice. And honestly, that stat might be sort of the best cherry on top to sort of explain or describe how good Jordan was on the defensive end. And so this kind of goes back to how sometimes when you bring up particular stats about Jordan, they sort of disregard it because, well, there might have been 1 or 2 other people better at what they did. But going from this, right, in terms of a guard, Jordan essentially was second to none in most categories. And if you're going to try and compare a guard's all-time blocks to a center's all-time blocks, then I don't think you're being honest about the dynamics of basketball in terms of the positional responsibilities and opportunities that come towards players whenever they are on the court. You wouldn't hold it against Dwight Howard that he doesn't have enough assists, as I've brought up similar examples previously. So a lot of times when you say, well, Jordan was a good defensive player, a lot of times they'll say, well, he wasn't top 10 all-time in blocks, or he wasn't top 10 all-time in rebounds. And it's a very disingenuous way of going about and deciphering how good a player was defensively, considering their responsibility or position. And so what's funny, as I did this research on Jordan's defense, I actually came away thinking that Jordan's defense may actually be a little underrated, which may be hard to say, but looking at some of these all-time ranks, whether for a guard or not, were quite impressive, and I didn't quite remember the accolades that Jordan had accomplished on the defensive end during his career. Another thing that is often leveraged against Michael Jordan from Tug is that Jordan was not a good three-point shooter, which is somewhat true. I usually don't push back too hard against this, except that we all know the game has drastically changed in terms of the way the three-point shot is looked at and the amount of time it's given in terms of working on it and making it a part of your personal game or team game. That being said, some of the best three-point shooters of all time essentially shoot in the 40% range. 40, 41, 42, something like that would be considered a pretty amazing year in terms of strictly a three-point shooting percentage. In terms of Jordan's career, he never really attempted more than 2 or 3 three-point shots a game. Oftentimes, he would shoot 1 to 2 or average even less than 1 during the regular season or playoffs. And again, this is one of those disingenuous critiques that Tug has against Jordan. But even as bad as Tug would like to claim that Jordan was in terms of being a three-point shooter, he shot 33% for his career in the regular season, which is average, I suppose. But given the fact that it was not really a part of his game, and if we want to be nitpicky and understand that Jordan probably shot a lot of last-second shots, whether it be at the end of a quarter or halftime, you could say that perhaps the average could be a little misleading. Now, what you can say about Jordan is that as he went from the regular season to the playoffs, if we actually go and look at Michael Jordan's NBA Finals three-point shooting percentage, it's actually 37%, which is pretty respectable considering Tug is saying he's not a good three-point shooter. Again, when it mattered most, Jordan stepped up. Although 37% is not the most jaw-dropping three-point percentage, rather for a regular season, playoffs, or finals, it does show that Jordan shot much better in the finals and stepped up when it was needed. And for the record, Michael Jordan's finals three-point percentage is only 3 percentage points behind Klay Thompson and 2.7 percentage points behind Steph Curry. Jordan's finals three-point percentage was better than LeBron James as well. And believe it or not, LeBron James and Michael Jordan have essentially the same career three-point percentage, except Jordan has a couple points on him in the NBA Finals. And this is with LeBron attempting at a minimum over 3 or 4 attempts per year, if not more. And again, it should be reiterated that the three-point shot was really not something that was a part of many players or even teams' repertoire back in the day. Yes, they were still, of course, good shooters. There's no denying that. But in terms of Jordan, he was very much a mid-range or attack the basket sort of player. And the three-pointer was something that he rarely ever relied on or even went to. And so it would be one thing if Jordan got up a lot of volume in his day and he still only shot 33% for his career. But given the fact he only shot 1 or 2 threes a game, that means that he was doing other things on those possessions that someone like a Steph Curry or Ray Allen or Reggie Miller were not doing in terms of going to the hole, attacking the basket, pulling up for the mid-range, getting fouled, etc. And while I agree Jordan is not necessarily blowing anyone away with his three-point percentage, it's mainly because he didn't have to. He wanted to score or attack the basket in other ways, and this is a good example in terms of the sort of styles that have changed from his time to now. Even though surprisingly the NBA three-point percentage has not moved much, the volume has definitely gone up. Another one of the critiques that Tug has against Michael Jordan is that he wasn't a good passer. And this goes much like the three-point percentage argument, in that while Jordan may have not been a pass-first guard, and his assist numbers were not jacked up to double digits, it doesn't mean that he wasn't a good passer. Keep in mind, Steve Kerr holds the all-time three-point percentage for the NBA, and he did it mainly while playing with Jordan, getting wide open looks. And in terms of assists per game, Michael Jordan averaged about 5.3 assists per game for his entire career. So again, while Jordan's assist numbers are not necessarily elite, it's not as if he was some horrible passer or couldn't find any open guys or didn't know what to do with the ball once the double or triple team came and couldn't find an open man. And again, as we look, as usual with Jordan, during the regular season, he averaged 5.3. During the playoffs, he averaged 5.7 for his career. And again, in the finals, Jordan averaged 6 assists per game. And in terms of a raw number, Jordan is 8th all-time in finals assists. And in the finals, Jordan averaged more assists than Jerry West, Kobe Bryant, Dwayne Wade, Tony Parker, and is tied with the likes of Larry Bird and Steph Curry in terms of NBA Finals assist average. So again, was Jordan Steve Nash or Magic Johnson? No, but that wasn't his game. And on average, Jordan averaged a pretty decent assist marker for his career, given that he was much more geared to being a score-first shooting guard. And so was passing a strength? You could argue perhaps not, but it definitely wasn't a weakness. And so those are a lot of the quote-unquote weaknesses that Tug brings up when you argue him, and he tries to kind of needle you about what Jordan may have not been so great at. So just to recap, Jordan was definitely a good leader. Your definition or your subjective opinion of what a quote-unquote team player is doesn't so much matter once we get down to the brass tacks. Leaders are not necessarily here to be liked. They are here to lead, and Jordan did that almost, if not better than anyone. Just because you pass more doesn't make you a better team player. Just because you are relentlessly positive and giving constructive criticism versus someone who maybe is a little harder on their teammates doesn't make you a better team player. And since what constitutes a good team leader or team player or not is subjective, it's really hard to deny or say that Jordan was not a good team leader, given the accomplishments that he achieved while leading his team to championships. Because one thing is for sure, if you don't win, you will never be considered a good team leader. So to say that Jordan was not a good team leader is quite baffling. Secondly, objectively speaking, there is no way you can say Jordan is an average defender. And I would go so far as to say Jordan, in terms of his position, although we could maybe even argue for any singular player, is easily one of the best defenders of all time. And specifically for his position, I would argue he is probably a top 5, top 10 at the very worst defensive player at the shooting guard or just guard overall position. Now, the two strongest cases that the opposition may have is in the 3-point percentage and assist numbers. Again, these were not some of Jordan's strengths, nor something that he relied on or went to heavily. And even more specifically for the 3-point shot, as that was just not something that was done a lot in the 90s. Again, Jordan only averaged about 1 or 2 3-point shots a game. And if we were going to go back and look at how many of those were last-second heaves, half-court shots, in the corner 3 balls at the end of a quarter or something, then those statistics would probably improve a little bit. Also, given the fact that Jordan's 3-point percentage gradually increased from the regular season to the playoffs, and he shot a pretty respectable 37% in the NBA Finals, which is only 2 to 3 percentage points behind players like Klay Thompson and Steph Curry. So again, when it mattered most, Jordan shot a pretty respectable 3-point percentage in the finals at 37%. So the last critique could possibly tie into the team player complaint that Tug has about Jordan in terms of his assist numbers. But again, considering he was such a scorer and averaged over 5 assists for his career and almost 6 assists in the playoffs and a flat 6 assists in the NBA Finals, those are decent assist numbers for someone who does what Jordan does. And the 6 assists in the NBA Finals are pretty respectable compared to some of the other great point guards who have played in the NBA Finals, much like Jordan's 3-point percentage. Again, when it mattered most and all eyes were on Jordan, he made the defense pay. And to sort of put a bow on this section, a lot of this has to do with the bias that Tug displays, and that the sort of scrutiny and the level at which he holds Jordan is very much a double standard. If we were going to nitpick like this over some of the all-time greats, there would be many more things we could find about them if we wanted to make critiques about their game. And so if we were going to hold all of the other all-time greats to this level of scrutiny, I guarantee you I could find more than 2 stats in which I could lambast them over to try and drag down their legacy the way that Tug does to Jordan. And the fact that 3-point percentage and assist are perhaps 2 of his better arguments, they are still very weak considering the angle and the logic he uses to go about attacking these 2 categories. And so from here, we're going to roll over into the final segment, in which we will go over all of Jordan's achievements, his all-time standings, his accolades, and his legacy overall. was kind of thinking about how I should end this video, considering we all know so much about Michael Jordan already. And I think the one thing that separates Jordan from so many other players, it's sort of a saying we've all heard before, but essentially it's how good was your good. You know, when you were in your prime and things were clicking, you had mentally and physically sort of peaked and you were at your best. I think a lot of people are drawn to players or people, whether it be sports, business, generals, wars, etc. How good was your good? When you were at your peak, when you were at your best, how good were you? Because that is ultimately one of the litmus tests, in my opinion, that people do, whether subconsciously or not, in terms of trying to decide who the greatest at something is. And of course, as said before, you can't just do it for 1 or 2 years, because then it becomes hard to separate a fluke or happenstance from actual skill and talent and hard work. There's a difference between, you know, how many times did you run the table? How fast could you run the table? How absolutely dominant could you be in your peak when playing against your peers? And I ultimately think this is the thing that draws people to Jordan and what makes him ultimately the GOAT. When Jordan was at his peak, when he was at his best, Jordan was unbeatable. No one could beat Jordan in the 90s when he was winning his 2 3-peats. And I think that's also important to mention, is that Jordan won a 3-peat, essentially took a 1.5 years, 2 years off. And I know that he did technically play towards the latter end of his 2nd year of retirement and didn't make it back to the finals. I understand that, but he also only played 17 games in the regular season once he came back. That's a bit of a small sample size to sort of hold him to account for. Also considering he was coming on to an almost totally different team, getting his legs back under him, etc. Now, I know he played good also when he came back, but it's sort of hard to judge him just for coming back, playing 17 games, coming off being in baseball shape, and trying to win another ring. And for any people who might have doubted him, when he did come back that 2nd year out of retirement, he put all of those doubts to rest when he won another 3-peat. And I think it's important to mention this, that for anyone who might have said Jordan was just a great player, or perhaps maybe was just one of the greats, etc., when he won his first 3, for him to come back and then win another 3, I think left a huge impression on people that when Jordan was at his peak, when Jordan was in his prime, when he was locked in, when he played for a full season during those 6 years that he won those 6 rings, Jordan could not be beat. Jordan was unstoppable. And to me, I think this really adds to the lore of Michael Jordan. And in my opinion, I think Tug takes it the other way, and he looks at things like his Gatorade commercials or the fact that he sold at Hanes underwear, and I think from his point of view, he thinks this is an example of how Jordan was boosted up in the media and became this bigger figure in people's minds than what he actually was on the court. And I take the other approach to it, saying that you had this once in a generation icon in which of course people wanted to monopolize on or capitalize on. And this largely started with Bird and Magic when they did their Converse commercial. And in that age, the growing of advertising and merchandise, etc., really went to another level because of those two. And so would you hold it against LeBron and sort of count it as a negative against his legacy that he's in so many commercials, or that he is so played up by the media, etc.? I don't really hold it against him. It's just sort of part of the game. And not to mention that it's a part of the game that is off the court and doesn't really have anything to do with their performance when they're playing. And so I think the 2 3-peats are sort of important to mention in terms of how he won them. That if there were any doubters, if there were any haters, as I've stated at the beginning of this video, if there was anyone who thought perhaps Jordan was not the greatest player, at least of his time, he essentially put that to bed when he came back and won his 2nd 3-peat. And so I think the phrase, how good is your good, is very relevant, not just in sports overall, but for the conversation of GOATs in terms of whatever respective sport you're debating. And we can sort of take people like Dan Marino or Charles Barkley as an example, and not to knock those guys. I love both of those guys in terms of players and personalities for the most part. But the reason why those guys will never be thrown into the GOAT debate, even though they won MVPs, and you could argue that they're two of the greatest players to ever play their sport, the bottom line comes down to the fact that at their best, they just weren't good enough. And again, I don't mean that as an insult. Perhaps you could say a bounce of the ball here or there and they win a ring. But the reason why players like that will never get thrown into the GOAT debate is because at their best, they simply just proved they were never good enough. And even further, if you look at guys who have won rings, whether it be one or multiple, the way we still look at those rings is still under the same microscope. This is why I think largely you could look at someone like Kareem, who has 6 championships, the same as Jordan, but the way in which he won them compared to his ability to dominate versus Jordan's is a little different. Again, Kareem won a championship early in his NBA career, and then it took him another decade to get back on top. And it wasn't until he joined up with 3, 4, 5 other Hall of Famers in LA to do so. And so when it comes to someone like Kareem, who has as many championships as Jordan, I think when people look at how Jordan won his championships compared to Kareem, I think it's pretty easy to say that Jordan's 6 championships were much more impressive. The way that he dominated as a single player for essentially what we will just say is 6 straight seasons. I know he retired and he came back at the end of that second one, but for the expediency of the argument, Jordan essentially dominated for 6 straight seasons. When he was at his best, when he was in his prime, Jordan was unbeatable, and it's kind of hard to argue against that, and there are not many other players who can make that claim. And we could even look at someone like Bill Russell, who won 11 championships, 5 more than Michael Jordan, and Bill Russell never won 2 championships in a row, which is sort of mind-boggling. And so when you think about that, and then you compare and contrast to Jordan, who essentially won 6 straight, I think even saying that, you could argue that Jordan's dominance during his peak was far superior than Bill Russell's, or any other player for that matter. Even the dynasty of the Spurs could never go back to back. And there really is no other player in NBA history who can make the claim that when they were at their best, that they did it as good or as long as Michael Jordan did. 6 straight years of essentially total dominance, and leaving no question in anyone's mind who the best player was in the 90s. And so let's look at just how dominant Jordan was and compare him to some of the other peaks of other elite players or GOATs that had come before after him, and let's see sort of what he has achieved. And so staying on the topic of how good was your good, we'll start with MVPs, as that's obviously the biggest individual award you could ever win. Michael Jordan is tied for second with Bill Russell and is only behind Kareem Abdul-Jabbar for MVPs for 5 and 6 respectively. And to be honest, many people agree that one of Bill Russell's MVPs should have gone to perhaps either Wilt Chamberlain or Oscar Robertson, considering that was the year that Oscar Robertson averaged a triple-double and Wilt Chamberlain got his 100-point game, and is considered by many to be one of the biggest snubs in NBA MVP voting history. But sort of going back to how good is your good, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar only won championships in the years that he won MVP for 2 out of the 6 years. And again, if you were going to argue like Tug does and say that this is a team game, well then winning MVPs while not winning as a team seems sort of like an empty stat. Now again, I wouldn't necessarily argue that, but to stay on the topic of it being a team game, Michael Jordan won 4 out of his 5 while winning rings, as did Bill Russell. And for the one MVP that Jordan won when they didn't win a ring, he also won Defensive Player of the Year in that same year, while also averaging 35 points per game, which is still a record for anyone who's ever won the Defensive Player of the Year award. And by the way, when Jordan won that MVP and Defensive Player of the Year award in 1988, he's only one of 4 players to do so, which I understand he didn't win a championship that year, but still goes to show his absolute dominance on both sides of the floor. Jordan also amassed an insane 10 scoring titles, and he did them 10 years in a row. Let that sink in. Again, how good was your good? For 10 straight years, Jordan was arguably the best scorer in the NBA. And on the topic of scoring just in general, again, I would like to bring up a little bit of the caveat or nuance of positions and or how players get their points. For example, if we look at the players who are on the all-time scoring list, we'll just take the top 10. Kareem, LeBron, Karl Malone, Kobe, Michael, Dirk, Wilt, Shaq, Carmelo, and Moses Malone. Now, if you were gonna ask me whose points are more impressive out of this top 10 list, I would probably tell you Dirk and Carmelo. Reason being, for them to score as many points as they did as almost being purely jump shooters is very impressive when we're talking about the game of basketball. And I know I'm a little biased towards Dirk, but I'm trying to be as objective as possible. The way that Dirk got his 31,500 points, in my opinion, was so much harder and required so much more skill or consistency at shooting than any of the other players in the top 10. And going along with that, we can sort of see a theme with the people who have amassed the most points in NBA history. The vast majority of them were either big men or what we'll just sort of call a slasher, kind of a guy who would go to the hole and was very athletic, such as a Michael Jordan or a LeBron James. But looking at this top 25 list, it's very obvious that it's either big guys or guys who can get quote unquote easier shots, guys who get their shots from a little bit closer in, whether it be a post play, a dunk, or a layup. And again, that makes sense. That's the game of basketball. A layup is a much easier shot than a three-pointer. And again, that just has to deal with the dynamics of the game. Players who get their shots from closer in, just on average, tend to score more points. They tend to find themselves perhaps getting a putback, a layup, an easier shot overall than someone who is more of a pure jump shooter or a three-point shooter, etc. And so when it comes to comparing Michael Jordan to someone like a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or a Wilt Chamberlain, the way that Michael Jordan got his 32,000 points, in my opinion, is more impressive than how Kareem got his. Again, not taking anything away from Kareem and the skyhook, and he earned all of the points that he got. But for a player who shoots more of a mid-range and has to sort of work to get his way to the basket, more so than compared to someone like Kareem, in my opinion, makes Jordan's all-time points a little more impressive, or that difference should be noted. And this will sort of roll over into field goal percentage. Jordan also holds the record for most points in a single playoff run with 759, doing it in 22 games. And in terms of guards, or at least some of the all-time great guards, from what I could find, Jordan is top 5 in field goal percentage as well. Jordan is essentially 4th in his shooting percentage, behind Magic, John Stockton, and George Gervin. And we can also count Otis Birdsong if we would like, as he did make over 5,000 field goals in his career. But again, he only beats Jordan out by 0.1%. 50% for a guard is remarkable and or pretty amazing for someone who shoots a lot of mid-range. Jordan also holds the record for most points in a playoff game. Jordan is also tied for second for most points in a single finals game, as well as being 4th all-time for points in the finals period. Keeping in mind that a lot of other players have actually gone to more finals than Michael Jordan has, but didn't come away with 6 championships. And of course, Jordan went 6 for 6 in finals MVPs, which again, I do not put a whole lot of statistical weight on finals MVPs. I think being the best player on your team and winning a championship essentially is almost the same as winning a finals MVP. But again, when I've brought up some of the other great dynasties or all-time greats who have gone to the finals, and there is no one who has won the finals MVP every time they have gone, unless you wanted to argue that Bill Russell may have won all of his back in the day before they had the award. And again, and staying on the topic of finals, again, Jordan went 6 for 6 with finals MVPs when he won the championship. Again, I'm not saying that the finals MVP is necessarily something that should be weighted very heavily. I think simply winning a championship as the best player on your team is essentially the same thing as a finals MVP. But again, it goes to show that when Jordan won his championships, when he was at his peak, there was no doubt who the best player was on the floor. Jordan also holds the record for most points per game for a career, as well as most points per game in the playoffs. And a lot of people will bring up Wilt Chamberlain, which is fair, and they will say how he had a much higher field goal percentage. And again, I think for anyone being honest, if we look at how Wilt Chamberlain got his buckets compared to Jordan, I would actually expect Wilt Chamberlain to shoot a little bit of a higher field goal percentage. Again, just given the history and the dynamics of the game. And so just to kind of round out some more of the things that Jordan accomplished in his career, he was also 10-time All-NBA first team, 1-time All-NBA second team, 14-time All-Star. He also holds the record for highest career box plus minus. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, the only player in NBA history to lead the league in scoring, win an MVP, and win Defensive Player of the Year in the same season. He also has led the league 3 times in terms of leading the league in scoring and steals in the same season, which is also a record. And even if you wanted to go the team route like Tug likes to, Jordan holds the best record that has ever been achieved by a team with 72 wins until the Golden State Warriors broke it 5 or 6 years ago, and they only beat it by 1 game. He also led the 95-96 Bulls to the best combined regular season and postseason record in NBA history at 87-13. Michael Jordan also holds the record for highest career efficiency rating both in the regular season and in the playoffs. Only guard in NBA history to lead his team in all 5 categories of points, rebounds, assists, steals, and blocks during a playoff series. He's the only player in NBA history to average at least 30 points, 6 rebounds, 5 assists, and 2 steals in a playoff run. That exact same stat, except with 6 assists instead of 5 assists. And surprisingly enough, like I mentioned earlier with Jordan's 3-point percentage, he's the only player in NBA history to shoot at least 38% on 3-point field goals in 3 NBA Finals runs, with a minimum of 15 points and 1.5 3-point attempts per game. He is one of 2 players to ever lead a championship team in all 5 main categories: points, rebounds, assists, steals, and blocks for at least 3 rounds of a playoff run. Hakeem Olajuwon is the only other one to do it. And this goes also back to my Scottie Pippen statistic that I pointed out earlier when comparing Kobe and Shaq to Jordan and Pippen. He is the only player in NBA history to lead a championship team with only 1 teammate averaging double figures in scoring. The 97 Bulls playoff run, Pippen averaged 19 points on 42%, which is not necessarily that good. All of his other teammates averaged under 8 points or less per game. He holds the most points per game in the NBA Finals for any single championship series. Jordan is also second all-time for finals points per game. He's the only player to score at least 40 or more points in the NBA Finals 4 straight times. He also led the league in win shares, most times for a career with 9. He also holds the record for most times leading the league in value over replacement, most times leading the league in PER, highest win shares per 48 of all time, only rookie in NBA history to lead his team in 4 statistics, one of 2 players in NBA history to score 3,000 or more points in a season, including tons of records with consecutive 20 or 30 or 40 point games, whether it be regular season or playoffs or finals. And to be honest, I could keep going on and on and on about the things that Jordan has achieved that either no one else has or perhaps only 1 or 2 other players have. But again, that's not so much why I'm here, and if people want, they can go look up a lot of these stats. But I thought it would also be interesting to sort of look at where Jordan's career would have stood had he never retired the first or second time. And I know, you can't give people credit for what they didn't do, but this sort of adds to the lore of Michael Jordan. And since I've already laid out such an argument for Michael Jordan on what he actually has done, I think we've earned the right to sort of look at what could have been. I think it's fun to look at where Jordan would have ended up had he never retired. And if we sort of average out his statistics, where would he have ranked at the end of his career? And so keep in mind, I'm only doing this because I've already made such an argument for Jordan. I think we've earned the right to also look at what could have been, as well as it being fun and interesting, and sort of ending it in a fun way. And we'll sort of mainly just focus on his regular season stats. And so this is what I found out when I averaged out a lot of Michael Jordan's career stats, roughly based on his averages that he had during his time with the Bulls, and then also the difference in averages between his last 2 years with the Wizards. And again, this would put Michael Jordan at 19 total seasons, which is still one less than someone like Kareem. And so I think this is sort of interesting to see where Jordan would have ultimately ended up. But again, this will ultimately go to illustrate and show just how good Jordan was, and that had he simply stuck around for a few more years, I think it would be absolutely, positively impossible to say that Jordan was not the greatest of all time. And you know, another player that people do this with a lot is someone like Larry Bird. Had Larry not gotten hurt in the middle of his career, or kind of in the twilight of his career, Bird would also have some gaudy numbers as well. And so let's go ahead and see where Jordan ended up ranking when I averaged out the main 5 statistical categories of points, steals, rebounds, assists, and blocks. And to me, the 2 stats that stand out the most are points and steals. Now, until LeBron came around, a lot of people thought that Kareem's 38,000 plus points would be almost impossible to catch, considering that Malone was the next closest player to ever get there, and he was still more than 1,000 points away. Had Jordan continued to play, and we use sort of a conservative estimate on his averages going forward for the years he retired, Jordan would be first in points with around 42,000, which would be around 3,500 more than Kareem. That is pretty crazy when you stop and think about it, that a guard like Michael Jordan would have ultimately ended up scoring 3,500 more points than the person who was in first place. It's quite amazing when you stop and think about it. And then we go to steals. Jordan is already third all-time in steals. Had he continued to play, he would have got about 3,250 more, 3,250 more steals. This is another one, much like Kareem, who people thought Kareem being the all-time points leader would be almost impossible to catch. This would put Michael Jordan roughly 20 steals behind John Stockton for all-time steals leader. Then we go to rebounds. Had he continued to play, he would have been roughly 60th all-time in rebounds with around 9,100, which would easily make him the #1 rebounding guard, strictly in terms of a total number of rebounds. And if we go to assists, he would have ended up having a little over 7,300 assists in his career, which would have put him at 16th all time. And again, we're talking about arguably the most prolific scorer in NBA history, also being top 20 in assists all time. Again, we're talking about arguably the most prolific scorer in NBA history, coming in the top 20 in terms of total assists for their career. And had Jordan continued to play, I think it would have been very hard, or it would be much harder for Tug to make the argument that Jordan is not a good passer had he ended up 16th all time. Again, would that make him the best? No. But to say that passing was a weakness of his would be a much tougher argument to make had Jordan just simply played out his career. And then of course the last category would be blocks. Now Jordan is already second place all time in terms of blocks for guards, right behind Dwayne Wade. This would obviously catapult him into first by a long shot. And in terms of all-time blocks, remember, being a guard, this would put him around the top 75 range, which again doesn't sound very good on its face, but remember, he would be the only guard essentially in the top 100, maybe even 150, and he would be punching above his weight by a wide margin. And so again, this sort of adds to the lore of Michael Jordan, that as good as Jordan was in his prime, as good of a career that Jordan had, in which it already stands alone by itself as being one of the best careers ever, objectively, this would have absolutely catapulted Jordan's career to probably an almost myth-like figure that no one would have ever been able to catch. I mean, the league is lucky he retired for 4.5 years. The fact that it's even a debate or discussion that someone may ever be as good as Jordan is only because he took several years off. Had Jordan continued to play, there would be absolutely no discussion, zero, zilch, that anyone could say that they were better than Jordan. And so again, going back to how good is your good, the fact that Jordan was as good as he was on the court, and still fans can say had he played those years he was retired, he would have been an almost untouchable figure in the game of basketball. Imagine if he had won 1 or 2 more MVPs. Imagine if he had won 1 or 2 more rings, which is definitely plausible. And again, I'm not here to give him credit for the things he didn't do, but again, this adds to the legacy that is Michael Jordan. And so, ladies and gentlemen, with that, and in conclusion, I have without a doubt made the case of why Jordan is the actual, objective, literal GOAT. No questions asked. Really, the only thing we have to ask ourselves now is if Tug will ever be man enough or have the cojones to debate me one-on-one or to even reply to this video. I'm going to guess that he won't, but who knows? And as the metaphorical saying goes, and I can't think of any better situation that it would apply to, Tug, the ball is in your court.